Hello everyone, this will be the 8th chapter of The Second Life of the Guardian, written and read by Insect Overlord. This chapter is titled How Heroes Are Supposed to Act, and has content warnings for minor character death, gun, violence, and implied past self-harm. Izuku was on his way to the market to get groceries with his mom when it happened. The first villain attack Izuku had ever witnessed. They had been walking along the sidewalk, hand in hand, when a sudden crash of glass sounded from across the street. Izuku startled and whipped his head around to see what caused the noise. There, standing in the storefront, was a man with no visible quirk, brandishing a gun. He looked frantic. He was shaking and jumping at the slightest sound. His finger rested on the trigger. If there was one thing worse than a man with a gun, it was a panicked man with a gun. Izuku was confused. He knew the world wasn't as black and white as the media made it seem, but still, the only villains in this world Izuku had seen had been loud and confident, yelling out their twisted ideals for all to hear. This man was neither. He just looked like a normal guy. Albeit a normal guy who was actively committing armed robbery, but Izuku believed that anyone could commit crimes if they were pushed hard enough. Still, the man's disposition made Izuku think this situation could be resolved without violence. So, imagine Izuku's surprise when Death Arm arrived on the scene and started yelling at the guy with a loaded gun. "Villain, drop your weapon and surrender!" Death Arm's voice boomed. The man trembled harder. "Hey, I don't want any trouble. My wife's sick and I need this money. If you don't let me leave, then I'll shoot," the man stuttered out. Izuku believed him. Death Arms, not believing his words or just not caring, moved forward to attack. He delivered a swift punch to the man's ribs, and the crowd cheered. They didn't notice the gun go off, but Izuku did. He dropped his mom's hand and rushed towards where the bullet would have gone. What he saw there made his blood turn to ice. A young girl lay still on the concrete, white uniform shirt quickly turning a vibrant shade of red. Izuku rushed forward, placing both of his small hands on the wound to try to stop the bleeding. Some of the people around Izuku seemed to notice the problem a few seconds later, and the air was quickly filled with shouts of, "Is there a doctor here?" and, "Quick, someone, call an ambulance!" Izuku could feel familiar hands attempt to pull him away from the body, but he struggled against them. He had to save her. Juluka's body was so cold, but Marinette had to save her. Izuku didn't know what to do. Marinette didn't know what to do. When Izuku comes to himself, it's to a crinkling blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looks up from his bloody hands to meet the concerned eyes of his mother. He doesn't bother asking after the girl. Izuku knows she's dead. He knew the wound was fatal before he jumped in, trying desperately, fruitlessly, to save her. His mom says something to him, but Izuku doesn't hear it. He's too busy replaying the situation in his mind. This was all Death Arm's fault. He hadn't tried to de-escalate the situation at all, just rushed in and attacked the man with a loaded gun. If he had acted differently, the whole situation could have been avoided. The girl would still be alive, and the man would only have been charged with attempted armed robbery and not effing manslaughter. Were all the heroes in the world like Death Arms? Izuku had only watched fights his mom deemed age-appropriate. He had never witnessed one in real life before today. What if those fights were the exceptions and were only aired because they made the heroes look good? Was All Might like Death Arms? If this was how daytime villains were treated, how did the heroes handle the truly heinous criminals? With that last thought, Izuku resolved to become a hero himself. Even in a world filled with heroes with superpowers, no one was there to protect the innocents. Izuku would protect those innocents. It was a Tuesday, Izuku's therapy day, and Oboro was having a hard time getting him to talk. The events of the day before had worn him out, and he felt like he was on his last thread of sanity. Izuku let his head lay heavily on the arms of the chair. His feet were pulled up to his chest, and he lay in an almost fetal position. Izuku's eyes were drawn to Oboro's wrists. It was a hot day, and he had rolled up his sleeves a bit. On his arms, Izuku could see a lot of scars. There were big ones, which were to be expected of an ex-hero in training, but there were also small ones, so faint they were barely visible and lined up in a way they couldn't have been made accidentally. We could color again if you want. I know you had a fun time with that before. I looked into multiple stores, but I couldn't find the markers you talked about. Sorry. But we could also just sit quietly if that's... You know, Izuku cut him off. I used to have scars too, in my old body. Oboro followed Izuku's gaze to his arms. What do you mean, kiddo? Izuku sighed. Guess he was doing this. Before I was Izuku, when I was Marinette, he clarified. I used to be a hero too, and he would be one again, even if he didn't want to. Oh yeah? Oboro sounded like he didn't believe Izuku, like he was just humoring the child. That made Izuku mad. Madder than it really should have, but Izuku had had a long day, and he was tired. He shouldn't feel this tired. This life was supposed to be better. Yes, he shouted. I used to be a hero, the only hero. There was a few others, but they didn't have the same responsibilities I did. They didn't feel the same pressure. I watched my parents die, you know. I watched them die over and over again, but I could never grieve them because Kwame forbid I ever feel any negative emotion. He knew he was getting too worked up, but Izuku had been bottling this up for years, and the thought that no one, not his parents and not his Kwame-damned therapist, believed him, it sent him over the edge. I had no one to help me or to understand me or listen to me, not even Master Fu. He left me alone. I was so alone. At some point, Izuku had gotten up from his chair and started pacing. He was vaguely aware of a hand at his scalp before a gentle hand was coaxing his own to let go. Izuku was full-on sobbing by this point. Something was placed in his hands and he started tugging it instead of his hair. Shh, it's okay, Izuku, I believe you, came Oboro's voice. Only he was speaking French. Had Izuku started speaking French on accident? Oboro sat with him, not really touching him, which he was thankful for, murmuring quiet reassurances in French until his sobs calmed into quiet sniffles. Feeling better? Oboro asked quietly. Izuku just nodded. His voice felt out of reach for a moment. If you want, I can keep speaking French with you. I know it can be easier to communicate in our first languages. Izuku nodded eagerly. He didn't know how or why Oboro knew French, but chalked it up to one of those weird Oboro things. The two of them sat together and drew for the rest of their session, Izuku wrapped in blankets and Oboro chattering about nothing in particular in French. It was nice. Izuku knew that Oboro would bring up what he said about his scars again, and he'd have to talk about his life as Marinette if he wanted to heal from his trauma. But for now, this was enough. This concludes Chapter 8 of The Second Life of the Guardian. I just want to say that Oboro knew French was Izuku's first language because it's what he reverted back to when he was stressed, and that's typically what we do when we know multiple languages. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I wanted to touch more on Izuku's trauma, and I hope you guys liked it. The next chapter should be up soon. Thank you so much for listening.